Hey Deanna, just wanted to film this recording to walk you through some of my thoughts, I guess, um, after reviewing your training peaks. So, as a little background, obviously, we don't coach you for your running side of things. We do work with you in person for the strength side. Um, and as of like February 14th, I think I have the date written down over here, but as of around February 14th, you were feeling too much pain in your foot to run. So this is just a video for us to figure out maybe some of the causes of like why that could have maybe happened. So this is your Training Peaks dashboard. I don't know if you can see it if you do have the free version, but this is just a couple chart summaries that we can see on our end. So I just quickly reviewed sort of like the previous year's volumes. The blue squiggly line is like your overall training volume. The red dots are like training stress score, and there's some other like training intensity in the blue, and like stress balance in some of the squiggly lines. But it's kind of nice to look at previous years of your training, just how consistent you were, kind of how like how big the peaks and valleys were is helpful. Gives us an idea too of like overall, so zero, for example, in your form, your training stress balance, zero being I am feeling not overtrained and not undertrained. Zero is right in the middle. So I just like to see sort of like overall, periods of crushing yourself, overall periods of bouncing back and feeling good. Last year, 2022, again, pretty consistent till this big drop. I think that might be a previous injury of yours as well. And then just how consistently you were able to build back a little bit last year. Kind of twice through two little big things there. What else stood out? This is this year. We don't have all the data on you yet, but it looked like you were having a pretty good increase, like a pretty steep, I would say, increase in your training around there. Let me just look at some of this. So, form. Let's just look at form for a second here. So, like, if I'm just hovering over some of the training points that you've built up this year, your form is consistently pretty negative this year. I guess the trends are also in the red and the yellow lines here too. Just like how crushed, I guess, compared to zero, or how crushed compared to baseline you were pretty often early in this year. And this is late January. Obviously, you had a little bit of rest leading into early February and started to crush yourself there again. Like a form of -28 is pretty steep. Like that's on the steeper side of things that we would like to see for how much volume we give you or how fast we crush you. -30 is a lot. But anyways, we're going to dive more into this. The first thing I wanted to bring up is training zones. So my first thing that I kind of pointed out or looked at, or one of the first things, was your heart rate zones. So this is just a compilation of all your workout types from December of last year till now-ish. And it just gives me an idea of how much time you're spending in zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, zone 4. So if you know anything about training zones, zone 1 and 2 are typically below your aerobic threshold. Zone 3 and 4 are between aerobic threshold and anaerobic threshold. And then anything above zone 4 is typically above anaerobic threshold. If you've heard of the 80-20 rule before, we like to say 80% of the work should be done in aerobic zones, especially if you're like a big endurance athlete, because so much of our volumes are like to get to high volumes, we need those intensities to go down just by default. You can't really keep the intensities high when you're running for hours. And you might have heard of like the junk training zone and stuff like that. So I won't get into like the philosophy of things too much here, but your heart rate zones, as you can see here, there's a lot of time spent in zone 3 and 4. That's like referred to as the junk zone to some people. And so as well, kind of in the lead up, this is sort of a per week breakdown, with the lightest colors being the lowest zone, zone 1, and then the darker colors being up into the higher zones. So just as a general breakdown, it looks like you're spending like an even amount of time for the most part in most of your zones, which leads me to wonder, if you've had your training zone set up properly and whether or not you follow any of those training zone recommendations, I guess, in your own training. This might be a philosophical question, I don't know. But I would like to see maybe you get some testing done if needed. We can do some field testing, or we can just do like some troubleshooting with you. But potentially these are just set up incorrectly with your heart rates. And so if that's the case, maybe you are training most of your time at a low enough intensity. But if they are set up correctly, and this is accurate depiction of where your training volume is going, you might be going too intense too often. That would be my first comment. I'll show you a graph quickly of an example. So another athlete of ours, and how his are set up. So very little time in zone 1, tons of time in zone 2, and quite a bit in zone 3 too. He could be just right on the edge of those two zones, and then very little in these higher intensity training zones. So again, his breakdown looks a little bit different than yours as well, just as a comparison. The second thing I want to look at is sort of like the more broken down microcycles we would say, or like the more broken down week to week training, and just maybe look at what went wrong maybe there. So you mentioned that you don't have a running coach, which is totally fine. So I can see that you've plugged in some of these training workouts on your own. I can tell that because they've turned green. Otherwise things would stay gray. But if you have a pre-scheduled workout and you complete the workout, then they turn colors. So overall, let's look at sort of the mileage you've been doing since early January. And I'm just going to look at the run mileage because it was a running injury that you got, a stress fracture. So I'm just going to spit out some of these numbers. This is early January. Your run distance here was 46.7. So we're looking at the bolded ones. 27.5 would just be what was scheduled in your training plan. And then this is what you actually did. So the bolded one says 46.7. The following week, you go up to 60.2. So that's like a 14K increase. You stay about the same the following week, 61.9. So you're nice and steady. This is a little bit of a red flag. So minus 70 for form. That's a big, big, big jump in volume compared to what you're used to. So this form calculation is based on your current fitness and the acute fatigue that this training program is putting on you. And your form is like a calculation of how crushed it's making you. So minus 70, we'll keep that in the back of our head. That's really, really low. That's really low. We said minus 30 was low, so minus 70 is really low. The following week, you're almost at minus 100. So you're feeling pretty crushed here, is my guess. And you jumped up your mileage by 20 kilometers that week. So we're at 80.5. The following week, you have a bit of a rest week, it looks like, and you run 30K. Now that's a huge drop from 80 to 30. So a 50K drop. Then you go back up by 25K from the previous week. That's a big jump as well. Coming along, we go down again to 34. So you've gone down 20 kilometers again. This is when you started to feel things in your foot. And down again to 15K. And this is when you stopped running because you couldn't run because of pain. It might be a little counterintuitive because this pain got the worst on some of the lowest training volume weeks. But usually running injuries and most chronic type injuries don't really happen. I mean, although they happen acutely, they don't happen on a given day for that reason of that one day's training or something like that. They usually happen as a buildup of the training volume over time, the stress on the tissue, and the overall ability of the tissue to recover. So with these numbers in the build up to when your pain in your foot started to hurt, I would call these a little bit red flaggy, where you're going up by 20 Ks and down by 20 Ks a week, sort of flip-flopping. So what we want to see is a little bit more consistency in those increases, like you've done a little bit better in the past 2 years. And then the other little red flag for me is just in the programming side. So I was just looking at sort of like, what did the program say? What was plugged in? So for example, the long run on the first week of January was 15 to 20K. The long run program the following week was almost double. That's a big increase for a long run one weekend. And then the other flag that I saw from this is that not only did the long run almost double, it looks like you might have done this 30K one on trails would be my guess, because if you're running 20K in 2 hours, I bet that'd be a pavement run based on pace. And then 24K in 4 hours sounds more like a trail run or something where you're on uneven terrain or maybe a lot of hills, because it took you a lot longer to run the 24K. So even though the distance, so we looked at distances before, I was like, ooh, that's like a big increase, 14K. But actually it's even bigger of an increase if you look at the amount of time you spent running in your long run specifically. Then for some reason you go back down to 22 to 24K, but you run 31K. Maybe you're just because you've known in your head that you ran 24 the previous week and now you want to run longer. But another like a big increase in volume in this long run. So like from a under 4 hours of running to over 5 hours of running, that's again a big jump. Even though, you know, kilometers wise you probably didn't feel too bad. And then again in the program, 24K max to 37K max, big jump. You did it, but I'm guessing this is probably on pavement because it only took you 4 hours. And so again, just like the difference in, I guess the inconsistencies and like the differences in where you're running will have an impact on the body. Obviously trails are going to be harder on the body for just the amount of time that you're out there. Nutritional strategies, the shoes that you wear might be different, which can have an impact on which muscles get tired in your foot, which muscles get tired in your upper leg, which put more stress on the foot, things like that. And then we're only really 3 weeks out from when your pain started hurting and you had that big drop in volume from the wedding, and then you went way back up in volume right before you got kind of hurt, let's call it. And so it can just be those like big periods of low volume followed by another big period of like running for almost 5 hours after a really low week. That might have been too much of a jump. Nutritionally, I've also seen some papers specifically on stress fractures in the foot where low intake like of dairy, vitamin D, well, dairy was what the papers I saw was on. So like that would be contributing like calcium, vitamin D, phosphorus, those types of nutrients that are found in dairy. The paper kind of found like there's a higher tendency for stress fractures in the foot when dairy consumption is low. I know you're vegan or vegetarian, and so it might just be interesting to get a blood test and just see if any of these like specific nutrients are missing. You don't necessarily need to include things in your diet that you're against putting in your diet, but maybe it would be interesting to look at supplementation for you. And last couple things that I have been looking at on here is just the pre-programming of like lots of weeks in advance that I might stay away from in general. And I know you just sort of copy pasted this from online. I personally like to do like more of like a week by week kind of thing. So if I was going to look at even like my own training program here, like aside from this one workout that was copied through, like I don't have any training over the next few weeks preloaded into my plan. And this is really just because anything can happen on a given day. And so if I pre-program, I mean, I have ideas of what I want to be hitting in the next few weeks, and I've got ideas of paces that I want to be hitting. But if I pre-program a bunch of weeks in advance, it just leaves not enough room for fluctuations that happen on a day-to-day basis. Like, I don't know when I'm going to have a week of crazy, not enough sleep, not enough recovery. And on those weeks, I need more flexibility to be able to recover and to be able to like lower my long runs even if needed, or if there's a bunch of symptoms coming up that I will write in my little comment section here, like, oh man, I'm feeling like I'm getting sick. Felt like I was gonna throw up after this run. Like legs are feeling like shit. Like if a bunch of these little symptoms come up, and you can see in my smiley faces, I was like not feeling so hot until today's run. Whereas usually when I'm typing in, I am like almost always feeling pretty great. In my running, I always have smiley faces across the board. So I knew that this week was one where we had to adjust. And actually, I have option 1, option 2 in my program for this week specifically, just because of how the early part of the week was going. That might be something you want to consider, even if you're training yourself, because you can write your own notes to yourself in your training peaks and just remind yourself like how you're feeling on a day-to-day basis, so that you can kind of be smart with like, okay, I had a 30K run scheduled, but the early 3 runs of the week aren't feeling great. I'm going to bump it down and give myself some like grace, basically, if needed. Trying to look and see what else I wanted to talk about. I think that's like basically it. I guess as like a wrap up, there's not really a way that we can always prevent injuries. Like injury prevention is a nice buzzword where we want to use strength training and use smart running volume training to lower the incidence of these recurring and acute injuries. But the reality is that sometimes we can't predict what that threshold of your body's tolerance in every area is going to be. And so these are just ideas that I've had looking through your training. They are not an exclusive list, and they are just things to, I guess, mull over. You can have a chat with me if you've got any questions about these. Overall, I hope it helps, and let me know if you have any questions about this stuff. Have a great Saturday.